The airport was busy, alive with the constant hum of announcements, rolling luggage, and the murmur of travelers. Among the crowd, a single mother was making her way toward the boarding gate, her little child holding her hand tightly. She had been working all day, running errands and managing her home on her own. The exhaustion was clear on her face, but she moved steadily, determined to reach the flight that would take her to an important meeting in another city. Her child was small, curious and constantly shifting from side to side, eyes wide as he took in the bustle around him. She held his hand firmly, guiding him through the crowd while keeping an eye on the departure board. She had checked in online the night before, printed the ticket, and made sure everything was in order. In her mind, there should have been no trouble at all. As she approached the gate, she noticed the airline staff giving her a second look. At first, she thought it was just routine, a closer inspection of boarding passes like they sometimes did. But as she handed over her ticket, the staff member, who appeared tense and cold, stared at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. The mother smiled politely and said, "Good evening. Here's our boarding pass." She tried to keep the tone friendly, hoping it would help the situation, but the staff member's eyes narrowed, and he handed the ticket over to a man who was standing nearby, a pilot, judging by the uniform. The pilot looked at her with suspicion, scanning the document slowly, almost as if trying to find a reason to refuse her. "Excuse me, ma'am, have you traveled with us before?" the pilot asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, many times," she replied calmly. "I always fly this airline." She noticed the impatience in his voice, the way he looked at her and then at her child, and felt a knot of worry form in her stomach. The pilot's eyes flicked over her documents again. "And your child? Are you traveling alone with him?" "Yes, we always travel together. I have all the necessary documents," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't understand why he was scrutinizing her so closely. The pilot leaned back slightly, his expression hardening. "I'm going to need some more information before you board. We have to make sure everything is in order." Her stomach sank. This was unusual. Usually boarding was quick and simple. Now it felt as though she was being singled out for reasons she couldn't understand. She remained calm, knowing that showing frustration or anger could make the situation worse. "Of course," she said. "I can provide any information you need." But the pilot's demeanor was growing colder. He asked more questions, each one more intrusive than the last. He questioned why she was traveling at this time, why she had a child with her, and even asked about her home and work situation. She answered politely, but she could feel the tension in the air rising. Other passengers nearby were beginning to notice the exchange, some stopping to watch, whispering quietly among themselves. Her child tugged at her hand, sensing her anxiety. She knelt down for a moment to reassure him. "It's okay, sweetie. Everything will be fine. Let's just wait a moment." The little one looked up at her with innocent eyes, unaware of the tension but picking up on her unease. The pilot finally leaned forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You cannot board this flight. Security will escort you off the plane immediately." She froze, disbelief flooding her mind. I cannot board?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a confirmed ticket. I've followed all the rules." I said no. "Security will handle this," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Her heart pounded in her chest. People were beginning to turn and look, some whispering, some filming with their phones. Humiliation and frustration mixed inside her. She had been careful, respectful, and patient, yet here she was, being treated as if she were a criminal. She stood tall, though her hands shook slightly. "Please, there must be some mistake," she said. "I have all my documents. I've done nothing wrong." The pilot didn't answer. He waved over two security officers who came quickly and positioned themselves beside her. She could see their unease, a faint flicker of doubt in their eyes, but they followed orders without question. The mother bent down to speak to her child. "Stay close to me, okay? Don't be scared." The child nodded, clinging to her hand, looking around at the crowd that had started to gather, some staring, some whispering, others filming. She felt a mix of anger and helplessness. She had faced challenges before, but never like this in such a public way. As they led her toward the exit from the plane, a few passengers called out in her defense. "Wait, this isn't right," one said. Another added, "She's done nothing wrong." But the pilot and security ignored them, determined to follow through with their decision. Her mind raced. She thought of her schedule, the meetings she needed to attend and the responsibilities waiting for her at the destination. But beyond that, she thought of the principle. She had the right to travel like any other passenger, and she would not let prejudice dictate her path. She kept her voice calm as she addressed the security officers. "I understand you are just doing your job, but I have done nothing wrong. Can we at least clarify why I am being removed?" One officer whispered something to the other, exchanging uncertain glances, but the pilot remained firm. "The decision has been made. Move her off the plane." They guided her down the steps, her child still holding tightly to her hand. Her face remained composed, but inside she felt a storm of emotion. Anger, frustration, humiliation, and determination all mixed together. She noticed the murmurs of passengers, some offering sympathetic looks, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Once they reached the bottom of the steps, she was directed to a waiting area. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself and her child. People were still staring, and a few approached to offer words of support. "I can't believe that just happened," one passenger said softly. Another added, "You didn't deserve that." She nodded politely, grateful for the kindness but aware that the situation was far from over. She knew she had to act carefully. Losing her temper could make things worse, but remaining silent might allow the injustice to go unchecked. Her child tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why can't we get on the plane?" he asked innocently. She knelt down, looking into his eyes. "Sometimes people make unfair choices, sweetie, but we will handle this the right way. Everything will be okay." The mother pulled out her phone and contacted the airline's customer service. She explained the situation clearly, calmly, and with patience, emphasizing that she had done nothing wrong. The representative listened, but the frustration in her voice was growing. She wanted this resolved quickly, not just for herself, but for her child, who was watching everything unfold. Meanwhile, passengers who had witnessed the incident began sharing their frustration online, posting videos and recounting what had happened. The mother had not asked for attention, but the injustice was so blatant that it could not be ignored. She felt a small spark of hope, knowing that the truth could emerge with public awareness. The pilot, still on the plane, appeared unaware of the growing attention. He had made his decision based on assumptions and prejudice, confident that he had authority. But his confidence only highlighted his mistake. The mother, despite her exhaustion, kept her composure, walking the line between firmness and politeness. She refused to let anger dictate her actions. Time passed slowly. She sat in the waiting area, her child asleep in her arms for a moment, finally exhausted from the stress and excitement. She knew she had to think carefully about the next steps. Calling the airline headquarters directly was her plan, and she would present her case calmly, providing evidence and documentation to show that she was in the right. She thought about the passengers, the staff, and the pilot. How would they feel once the truth was revealed? She imagined the pilot's reaction when he realized he had acted unjustly, but she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on what she could control: her actions, her words, and her calm demeanor. Despite the humiliation, there was a quiet strength in her. She had faced challenges before, and this was just another test of her resilience. Her child stirred, waking up and rubbing his eyes, and she smiled softly, reminding herself that she had to remain strong not only for herself but for him. As she waited, she observed the airport around her, the people rushing to gates, the announcements over the loudspeakers, the families reuniting after long trips. Life moved on, indifferent to her struggle, but she refused to let it defeat her. She gathered her documents once more, ensuring that everything was ready for the conversation with the airline headquarters. She rehearsed her words silently, planning to stay calm, respectful, and factual. There was no room for anger or confrontation, only clarity and truth. Finally, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. The representative answered, and she began explaining everything in a clear, calm voice. She detailed the events, her actions, her documents, and the pilot's behavior. She did not accuse, but stated the facts, presenting a strong, undeniable case. As she spoke, she noticed a shift in the environment around her. Airport staff who had initially been indifferent now seemed to take notice. Fellow passengers who had been watching now whispered among themselves, realizing the unfairness of the situation. Although the first part of her journey had been humiliating and painful, she felt a quiet determination building within her. She would not let prejudice dictate her life. She would not allow assumptions and bias to take away her dignity or her child's sense of safety. The conversation continued, her voice steady and unwavering, as she prepared to turn this moment of injustice into a moment of accountability and change. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She would face it with courage, composure, and an unshakable sense of right. After being escorted off the plane, the single mother and her child sat in a quiet corner of the terminal. The hum of the airport felt heavier now, as though the air carried the weight of the humiliation she had just endured. Her child, small and innocent, leaned against her shoulder, sensing her unease but not fully understanding what had happened. She held him close, brushing a lock of hair from his face and trying to calm her own racing thoughts. Her mind replayed every moment on the plane, the pilot's harsh words, the cold stare, the way the security officers had escorted them off without explanation. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed every rule, prepared every document, and remained polite and calm throughout the ordeal. And yet here she was, treated like a troublemaker or a threat. The unfairness of it made her chest ache. She watched passengers moving past them, some heading to gates, some rushing to catch flights, and a few glancing curiously in her direction. A few whispered to each other, some giving sympathetic looks, but most were absorbed in their own lives. She understood. Airports were full of people with their own schedules, their own worries, but the sting of being singled out felt sharp in that moment. The child tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why did the man make us leave?" he asked softly. His small voice, full of innocence, pulled at her heart. She knelt down to look him in the eyes. "Sometimes, sweetie, people make mistakes. They do things that are not fair. But we will handle it. Everything will be okay." He nodded, trusting her completely, unaware of the full weight of the situation. She hugged him close, feeling the responsibility of protecting him not just from danger, but from the confusion and fear that this moment had brought. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone again. The first step was to contact the airline's headquarters directly. She knew that complaining at the gate or arguing with the pilot would do little. She needed someone with authority, someone who could understand the injustice and take action. She dialed the number and waited, trying to steady her voice before speaking. When the representative answered, she explained clearly and calmly what had happened. She described the boarding, the pilot's behavior, and the fact that she had complied with every requirement. She did not raise her voice or allow frustration to show too strongly. She knew that the facts would speak for themselves if presented carefully. The representative listened, occasionally typing notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. She explained again, emphasizing that her child was with her, that she had a confirmed ticket and that there was no reason for the pilot to have removed her from the flight. The words came out measured, precise, and calm, even as anger bubbled beneath the surface. Meanwhile, around her, the airport continued its rhythm. Passengers moved past, some catching glimpses of the conversation, some whispering to each other. A few had recorded the earlier incident and were already sharing clips on social media, spreading awareness of the unfair treatment. She had not asked for attention, but the truth had a way of finding its way into the light. The child yawned, leaning against her shoulder again. She gently patted his back. "Just a little longer, sweetie. Mommy's making sure we're treated fairly." The little one nodded, trusting her completely, and she felt a quiet surge of determination. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling heavy with anticipation. She spoke to the airline representative, staying calm but firm. She repeated facts, referenced her ticket, and explained the pilot's behavior. She did not accuse. She did not yell. She simply laid out the truth. The representative promised to investigate and to escalate the matter to higher management. She thanked the representative, knowing that this was only the beginning. There was no guarantee of immediate resolution, but she had planted the seeds of accountability. As she hung up, she noticed a few passengers who had witnessed the incident approaching her. One elderly man spoke first, his voice low but sincere. "I'm so sorry that happened. That man had no right to treat you that way." Another added, "I saw what he did. You didn't deserve it. Don't let him get away with this." She smiled softly, grateful for their support. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It means a lot to know that others saw what happened." The mother's mind began to shift from the initial shock to a careful planning mode. She knew she needed to remain calm, to document everything and to prepare for the next steps. She had to protect herself and her child, but she also wanted to ensure that this injustice would be addressed. She reviewed the boarding pass, her identification, and her travel documents once more. Everything was in order, exactly as it should be. She made notes about the pilot's behavior, the timing of events, and the interactions with security. She knew that being precise and factual would strengthen her case. Her child began to fidget, restless after sitting for so long. She took him by the hand and walked slowly through the terminal, pointing out airplanes and asking questions about the people moving around them. "Look at that plane," she said, trying to distract him. "See how it's getting ready to take off? One day you'll fly on a plane like that too." He giggled and nodded, momentarily forgetting the earlier stress. She smiled, feeling a sense of relief. Even in the face of unfairness, she could still protect the small moments of joy for him. She noticed the reactions of other passengers. Some continued to whisper among themselves, sharing what they had witnessed. A few had taken videos and were showing them to others, highlighting the injustice in real time. She realized that the incident was already creating ripples, reaching beyond the airport walls. Her mind wandered briefly to the pilot. He had acted with arrogance, certain that his authority allowed him to make judgments based on bias. He had no idea who she really was or what her influence might be. That ignorance, she realized, would soon become his undoing. But she pushed that thought aside, focusing on what she could control: her composure, her actions, and her child's comfort. She found a quiet seating area and sat down, letting her child rest on her lap for a moment. He leaned against her shoulder, eyes drooping, and she gently stroked his hair. The exhaustion of the day, combined with the stress of the incident, was beginning to weigh heavily on her. She allowed herself a brief moment to feel the emotions: anger, frustration, humiliation, but she quickly set them aside. Now was the time for clarity, not for letting emotion dictate her next steps. Pulling out her phone again, she began drafting a message to the airline's corporate office, summarizing what had happened and including photos of her ticket and identification. She kept the tone calm and professional, presenting facts without exaggeration or accusation. Her goal was to ensure that anyone reviewing the case would see the truth clearly, without distraction. Around her, the airport continued its steady rhythm. People rushed to their gates, families reunited, and travelers hurried past. But she remained focused, a calm determination growing within her. She would not let this moment define her or allow the pilot's prejudice to go unchecked. She thought about the passengers who had spoken to her earlier. Their support, though small, reminded her that fairness and justice mattered to more people than she might have realized. Even strangers could recognize right and wrong, and their acknowledgement gave her a sense of hope. Her child stirred again, looking up at her with curious eyes. "Mommy, will we get to fly now?" he asked, his voice tentative. She smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "Yes, sweetie. We will make sure that happens. Mommy is taking care of everything." The hours seemed to stretch on, each minute testing her patience and resilience. She remained calm, documenting everything and preparing for the eventual resolution. She knew that standing firm, staying composed, and presenting the facts clearly were the most powerful tools she had. As the day moved toward evening, the mother finally received a call from the airline headquarters. The representative on the line was polite and attentive, acknowledging the incident and promising immediate action. They assured her that the matter would be investigated thoroughly and that steps would be taken to address the behavior of the pilot. She thanked the representative, feeling a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. This was not the end of the ordeal, but it was a step toward justice. She could finally see a path forward, a way to ensure that the unfair treatment she had endured would not be ignored. Her child, tired from the long day, leaned against her shoulder and closed his eyes. She held him close, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly as hope began to replace despair. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of control returning. As they waited for the next steps, she reflected on the lesson of the day. People could act unfairly, make assumptions, and abuse their authority. But courage, calm, and dignity could counteract even the most unjust treatment. She would not allow prejudice to define her or her child's experience. The airport, once a place of humiliation and fear, now felt like a stage for resilience. She sat quietly, her child resting in her lap, and prepared for the next part of her journey. one that she would face with strength, clarity, and unwavering determination. Though the pilot had sought to humiliate her, she knew that the truth would ultimately prevail. Her calm, her patience, and her composure were her greatest tools, and they would guide her toward justice. The next morning came quietly. The single mother woke up early in the small airport lounge where she had spent the night with her child. The long hours of waiting had left her exhausted, but she refused to let her spirit break. Her child was still asleep, curled up beside her, holding onto his small toy plane, the same one he had carried since the beginning of their journey. She smiled faintly as she looked at him, reminding herself that she had to stay strong, not just for herself but for him. Outside, planes were taking off one after another, and the sound of engines echoed through the glass walls of the terminal. She took a deep breath and stood up slowly. Today would be different. Today, she decided, the truth would come out. She walked over to a quiet corner, pulled out her phone, and opened her email. Overnight, several messages had come through. One was from the airline's head office, confirming that her complaint had been received and was being reviewed by the company's senior management. Another was from a news outlet that had seen one of the videos recorded by passengers. The story was spreading faster than she had imagined. At first, she hesitated to respond to the journalists. She didn't want attention for the wrong reasons. She only wanted fairness, not fame. But she knew that public awareness could help bring the truth to light. She drafted a short message, polite, calm, and focused only on the facts. She explained that she had been removed from the flight without reason. Despite having valid documents and following all rules, she ended the message with one line: "I only wish to be treated as any human being deserves to be." After sending it, she sat down again, sipping a cup of coffee. She glanced at her child, who had just woken up and was rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're going to have a better day today." He nodded, still half asleep, and smiled. "Are we flying today?" he asked hopefully. "Yes, we are," she replied gently. "We just have to talk to some people first." Not long after, her phone rang. It was a call from the airline's headquarters. The representative on the other end sounded more formal this time, clearly aware of the seriousness of the situation. "Ma'am," the voice said, "we reviewed your report, and we would like to confirm a few details. Our senior management would also like to speak with you directly." "Of course," she replied calmly. "I'm at the airport. I'm available right now." A few minutes later, she was guided to a private office near the customer service area. A manager from the airline met her there, his expression professional but nervous. He asked her to take a seat, and she did, placing her bag neatly beside her. Her child sat quietly next to her, swinging his legs back and forth. The manager cleared his throat. "We reviewed the incident that took place yesterday," he began carefully. "We understand that the pilot removed you from the flight, citing security concerns. However, after reviewing the footage and speaking with witnesses, it seems there was no valid reason for that action. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what happened." She listened silently, her face calm and unreadable. She appreciated the apology, but she knew it was only the beginning. She nodded slightly. "I appreciate your acknowledgement," she said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about how easily someone can be treated unfairly without being heard." The manager shifted in his seat. "You're absolutely right. We are taking this matter seriously. In fact, our headquarters asked me to confirm your full name and occupation for our internal report." She reached into her bag and handed him her identification card. The moment his eyes fell on it, his expression changed completely. He blinked twice, looked back at the card, then back at her, clearly stunned. "You're," he began, his voice faltering. "You're with the National Aviation Authority?" She nodded calmly. "Yes, I oversee passenger rights and airline compliance. I was traveling to attend a conference where airline ethics and discrimination in aviation were to be discussed." The room fell silent. The manager looked as if the ground had just been pulled out from beneath him. His hands trembled slightly as he set the ID back on the table. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "Ma'am, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I assure you the pilot didn't know either." She met his eyes steadily. "That's exactly the problem," she said softly. "He didn't need to know who I was to treat me fairly. He just needed to do his job without prejudice." Her words hung in the air like a quiet thunder. The manager nodded slowly, clearly ashamed. "You're absolutely right. There is no excuse for what happened. I'll escalate this immediately to our regional director." We will take full responsibility. She nodded again, calm but firm. I hope you do. Not because of who I am, but because no passenger should go through what I did. Just then, another man entered the room. His suit was crisp and his expression serious. He introduced himself as a senior executive from the airline. The manager quickly briefed him on the situation. As the story unfolded, the executive's expression darkened. He turned to the mother and said, "We deeply regret what happened. I assure you, this is not how we want our airline to be represented. We will personally handle the disciplinary process for the pilot involved." She didn't smile, but there was quiet strength in her gaze. "Thank you," she said. "I just want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The executive nodded firmly. "Understood. We'll also arrange for your immediate travel today in first class at no cost. It's the least we can do." She hesitated for a moment before accepting. She wasn't interested in luxury. She just wanted fairness. But she also knew that refusing could be misunderstood, so she agreed politely. "Thank you. I appreciate it." As she left the office with her child, she noticed several airline staff members watching her quietly. Some recognized her from the previous day, and their expressions were a mix of shame and respect. The story had clearly spread. Back at the gate, a different flight crew greeted her warmly. Their tone was respectful, almost cautious as they assisted her and her child onto the plane. The attendants made sure they were comfortable, offering snacks and helping with the bags. It was a stark contrast to what she had experienced before. As she settled into her seat, she looked out the window. The clouds drifted slowly across the sky, calm and steady. Her child leaned against her arm, smiling as he looked out at the runway. "Mommy, we're flying now," he said excitedly. "Yes," she whispered, smiling softly. "We finally are." While the plane prepared for takeoff, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from the same journalist she had emailed earlier. The reporter had already published an article about the incident, highlighting not just what happened but also her role as a key figure in the aviation industry. The article's title read, "Passenger Rights Official Removed from Flight by Airline Pilot, Calls for Accountability in Aviation." She sighed softly. She hadn't wanted attention, but perhaps this was how change began. The truth was out, and the story was bigger than her. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of who they appeared to be. The pilot, from the previous day, had no idea how his behavior would ripple through the entire company. Reports were already circulating internally, and upper management had begun an investigation. The captain's career, once spotless, was now under scrutiny. As the plane began to move down the runway, she held her child's hand. The sound of the engines grew louder, filling the cabin. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the moment wash over her, a mix of relief, sadness, and quiet victory. Once the plane was in the air, she looked around. Passengers nearby smiled politely, unaware of who she was or what she had been through. And she liked it that way. She didn't need recognition or praise. She just needed peace. Her child pressed his face against the window, pointing at the clouds. "Look, Mommy, we're in the sky," he said, his voice full of wonder. She smiled, her heart softening. "Yes, we are. Always remember, no matter how unfair things seem, we can rise above them." The flight was smooth, quiet, and peaceful. As the hours passed, she reflected on how quickly things had changed. One day she had been humiliated in front of strangers. The next, she had stood calmly, revealed the truth, and turned that pain into purpose. When the plane finally landed, the crew thanked her personally for flying with them. The airline manager at the destination was waiting near the gate, ready to escort her out with full respect and apologies. Cameras were flashing nearby as journalists tried to catch a glimpse of her, but she walked calmly, holding her child's hand. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't want anyone ruined. She just wanted to remind people of something simple, that dignity and respect should never depend on appearance, status, or assumptions. As she left the airport, she felt the sun on her face. Her child skipped beside her, laughing, happy that their long journey was finally over. She smiled at him, feeling a deep sense of peace. The day had been long, painful, and exhausting, but it had also revealed something important, that sometimes grace and calm can speak louder than anger. Somewhere miles away, the pilot who had humiliated her sat in a meeting with his supervisors. The realization of who she was and what he had done weighed heavily on him. For the first time, he saw how his actions had consequences far beyond that single flight. But she wasn't thinking about him anymore. She had already moved forward, ready to focus on her work, her child, and the message her experience carried. Life had tested her strength, and she had answered with quiet dignity. The airline's waiting area was filled with low murmurs as news of what had happened started spreading. Some passengers who had seen the mother being escorted off earlier were now whispering about a strange buzz among the crew members. Something was going on behind the scenes, and it looked like the pilot wasn't as confident as before. Inside a quiet staff office, the pilot sat stiffly at a small desk while the airline supervisor spoke to someone on the phone. The pilot's face was tense. His earlier arrogance had disappeared. He tapped his fingers nervously on the table, pretending to check flight schedules on his tablet, but his mind was racing. The supervisor hung up the phone and gave him a serious look. "You need to stay here," she said firmly. "We're sorting this out." He tried to sound calm. "I followed procedure. She was—" The supervisor raised a hand to stop him. "You'll need to let us handle this. There's more to the situation than you realize." Those words hit him harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" he asked, but the supervisor didn't answer. She left the room, closing the door behind her. At the same time, in another part of the airport, the single mother was sitting quietly with her child beside her. Her little Fawn was drawing on a piece of paper with a crayon, completely unaware of how serious the day had become. She sat there silently, her phone in her hand, waiting for the call she had been promised from the airline's headquarters. When her phone finally rang, she took a deep breath and answered. Her voice was calm, steady, and polite. "Yes, I'm here." The voice on the other end was respectful. "Ma'am, we want to deeply apologize for what happened. It appears there has been a misunderstanding of the highest order. We are investigating this immediately." She simply replied, "I appreciate that. I just hope this helps make things better for others too." She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand special treatment. There was a quiet strength in her tone that could make anyone listen. Meanwhile, the supervisor returned to the office and looked at the pilot. "Do you have any idea who that woman is?" she asked. He frowned. "A passenger who didn't follow protocol." The supervisor sighed. "That passenger is one of the top officials on the board of the Aviation Safety Council. She's part of the team that reviews airline operations, including ours." The pilot's eyes widened and his hands froze on the table. He didn't even blink for a moment. "That can't be right," he whispered. But it was true. The same woman he had thrown off the plane was someone who had spent years improving air safety laws and fighting for fair treatment of both passengers and airline staff. She had traveled on hundreds of flights, quietly, humbly, never expecting to be recognized or treated differently. The realization began to crush him from the inside. All the pride and authority he had felt earlier were now replaced by guilt and fear. He remembered the look on her face as she held her child, the calmness with which she had accepted humiliation in front of everyone. He had mistaken dignity for defiance. The supervisor continued. "Headquarters wants to speak with you. They're not happy." He stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak. His usual confidence was gone. He knew this wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about the kind of person he had been. The words he'd spoken, the tone he'd used. All of it was echoing, in his mind now, louder than the crowd that had once filled the boarding gate. When he joined the video call, the senior official from the airline looked straight at him. "We have confirmed that your decision to remove the passenger was not based on any valid reason," the official said firmly. "We also have multiple witness statements describing your behavior as unprofessional." He tried to defend himself, but the words didn't come out right. "I thought she looked—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing how ugly that excuse sounded. The official leaned forward slightly. "You thought wrong. You made a judgment based on appearance. And now that judgment has caused damage not only to her but also to this airline's reputation." He lowered his head. The truth was impossible to escape. Outside, word had already spread among the passengers waiting for their next flights. Some of them were posting online about what they had witnessed earlier. Not the argument, but the woman's calmness. her quiet composure even when treated unfairly. Many wrote how they hoped justice would be done. The pilot finally walked out of the office, his steps slower than before. He looked through the glass wall of the waiting area and saw her again, the same woman he had forced off the plane. She was now sitting with two airline representatives, speaking softly. The pilot hesitated, unsure if he should approach her, but something inside told him he needed to. When he finally walked closer, every step felt heavier. The air around him felt thick. He stopped a few feet away and said quietly, "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry for what happened earlier. I made a terrible mistake." She looked up at him calmly, her child still drawing beside her. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet disappointment. "Mistakes happen," she said softly, "but some mistakes can teach us things we don't learn in training." He nodded, unable to look her in the eye. "You're right," he said. I don't have an excuse." For a long moment there was silence between them. People nearby pretended not to look, but they were listening closely. The tension wasn't hostile. It was heavy with realization. She finally said, "I've seen people lose their tempers before. I've seen them misuse their power. What matters is what they do after that." Those words struck him deeply. He had been trained to handle pressure, emergencies, and hundreds of passengers' lives. Yet he had failed at something as simple as treating another human being with respect. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that," he whispered. The airline's representatives came over, informing her that a new flight had been arranged. She stood up, helped her child gather their things, and prepared to board again, this time with full dignity and respect. The pilot watched her walk away, feeling the weight of his own actions pressing on his chest. Later that evening, he sat alone in the pilot's lounge, staring at the coffee cup in his hand. The usual noise of the place, laughter, chatter, and flight announcements, faded in the background. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head, the tone of his own voice when he had ordered her off, the frightened child, the eyes of the passengers watching. He realized how many times he might have spoken to people in that same sharp, dismissive tone without even noticing. He had always seen himself as professional, but now he saw how quickly pride could turn into cruelty when mixed with prejudice. Hours later, he wrote a detailed apology letter, not because the airline asked him to, but because he needed to. He admitted his wrongs clearly, without excuses, and promised to undergo training to better understand and confront his biases. When the woman received the message the next day, she read it quietly. She didn't reply immediately. She wasn't looking for revenge. All she wanted was awareness, a change that could make the skies a little fairer for everyone. The incident made headlines briefly, but what people remembered most was her calmness. Some praised the airline for taking swift action. Others shared how powerful it was to see someone face discrimination and respond not with anger, but with quiet strength. The pilot, meanwhile, was temporarily suspended and required to attend counseling and diversity sessions before he could return to flying. He accepted every condition without argument. He knew he had earned it. In the days that followed, he found himself thinking differently. When he passed through airports, he noticed people he had once ignored. The cleaners, the passengers rushing with kids, the elderly struggling with luggage. For the first time, he saw them not as faces in a crowd, but as stories, as lives with struggles he knew nothing about. It was a quiet transformation, one that started with shame but grew into understanding. And though he knew he could never undo that day, he hoped his future actions would speak louder than his mistake ever did. Back at home, the woman finally tucked her child into bed that night. She sat by the window looking at the lights of the city outside. The day had been long, painful, and exhausting, but somewhere in her heart, she felt peace. She hadn't shouted or fought back in anger. She had let truth speak for itself. She whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes silence teaches louder than words." Her child stirred in sleep, holding the same crayon drawing from the airport, a small plane flying across the sky, surrounded by clouds. She smiled faintly, brushed a hand through the child's hair, and whispered, "Tomorrow will be better." and in that quiet room she believed it. The next morning, the airport was busy again, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. People rushed through security lines, children laughed, luggage rolled across shiny floors, and planes rose and landed in the distance like giant birds. But for a few people who had been part of the incident the day before, things didn't feel the same. The single mother returned to the airport, holding her child's hand. She had been invited back by the airline for an official meeting. Her calm nature remained the same, but there was a quiet confidence in her steps now. The staff who had been present the day before recognized her immediately. Their faces softened with guilt and respect. When she reached the airline's office, a senior manager greeted her politely. "Thank you for coming back, ma'am. We want to formally apologize for what happened yesterday." She nodded and smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. I didn't come here for revenge. I came because I believe this can be a chance for change." The manager looked slightly surprised but also relieved. He gestured for her to sit and they began to talk. She shared her thoughts clearly and respectfully about how small assumptions can lead to big harm, how people in uniform must remember that passengers are not problems to manage but humans with stories, fears, and struggles of their own. Her words weren't angry. They were thoughtful, almost gentle, yet they carried more weight than shouting ever could. Everyone in the room listened carefully. After the meeting, the airline released a public statement acknowledging the incident and announcing that they would be introducing new training sessions focused on respect, empathy, and handling passengers with care. The story quietly spread online, not as a scandal but as a lesson. Some people recognized the mother's name and background when her role in aviation was mentioned. Many admired her for not using her position to embarrass anyone. Others were simply moved by her calm dignity throughout the entire ordeal. Meanwhile, the pilot had been placed on leave. He stayed at home away from the skies he loved. For days, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman's words. Some mistakes can teach us things we don't learn in training. He thought about how easily he had judged someone just because she didn't fit his picture of what a typical passenger should look like. He thought about how his pride had blinded him and how quickly authority had turned into arrogance. But more than guilt, he began to feel something else, a desire to change. He started reading about unconscious bias, about human behavior, about how people see the world through their own filters. He attended every training session the airline arranged for him, not just because it was required, but because he truly wanted to learn. In one session, a speaker said, "Sometimes, the best pilots are not the ones who know how to fly perfectly, but the ones who know how to treat others with humility and kindness." Those words hit him deeply. He realized that all his technical knowledge meant nothing if he couldn't carry the responsibility of being a decent human being. Weeks passed. Slowly, his suspension was lifted. But before he could return to duty, he requested one thing: to meet the woman again. The airline arranged the meeting. It was held in a quiet lounge area of the airport, away from the noise of travelers. She arrived on time, her child once again holding her hand, calm and curious as always. The pilot stood when she entered, visibly nervous but sincere. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," he began. "Not just for forgiving me, but for teaching me something I should have known a long time ago." She looked at him calmly. "You don't owe me thanks," she said softly. "You owe yourself a promise that you'll never treat anyone that way again." He nodded quickly. "I won't," he said. "I can't change what happened, but I can make sure it never happens again. Not with me, not with anyone on my team." There was a long silence after that. The air between them felt lighter, no longer filled with tension, but with quiet understanding. Then she said, "Do you know what my job really is?" He hesitated. "I read your file after." "Everything. You're on the Aviation Safety Council." She nodded. "Yes, but before that I used to work as a flight attendant. I know what it's like to be exhausted, overworked, and under pressure. I know how it feels when passengers lose patience. But I also know what kindness can do. Sometimes a simple act of respect can save a day, even a life." The pilot listened carefully. Every word she spoke felt like a mirror reflecting his own past behavior. He had spent years chasing perfection in procedures but had forgotten the heart behind the profession, the human side of flying. They talked for nearly an hour. It wasn't a formal meeting. It was two people sharing lessons, stories, and quiet reflections. When it ended, she stood up, offered him a polite handshake, and wished him safe skies. He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he whispered again. After she left, he sat there for a long time, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. A few weeks later, he returned to work. The day he stepped into the cockpit again, he paused for a moment before touching the controls. The sky outside was golden, filled with sunlight. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just feel like a pilot, he felt like a person with purpose. Before takeoff, he walked through the cabin, greeting passengers one by one, something he had never done before. He smiled at the families, helped an elderly passenger with her luggage, and even knelt down to say hello to a child who looked nervous about flying. One of the crew members whispered to another, surprised. "He's changed," she said softly, and he had. The arrogance was gone. In its place was warmth, patience, and genuine care. Far away, the mother and her child were finally living peacefully again. Life had returned to normal, though the memory of that day would always stay with her. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of how powerful calm strength could be. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. It was from the pilot. It wasn't long, but it was heartfelt. He wrote, "You once said some mistakes teach lessons we can't learn in training. You were right. Because of you, I've learned what it really means to carry people, not just through the air, but through kindness. I owe that lesson to you." She read it quietly, then placed it in a small box where she kept things that reminded her of life's turning points. Her child's first drawing, an old boarding pass, and now, this letter. Time passed and the world moved on, but every now and then, when she traveled for work, she would look at pilots and cabin crew and wonder if any of them had heard her story, or if it had inspired them in small ways. As for the pilot, he never forgot her face. Whenever he flew, he reminded himself that every person boarding his plane was carrying their own unseen struggles. Maybe some were running late, maybe some were scared of flying, maybe some were simply tired of life's weight. He started telling his junior crew members stories, not about airplanes or procedures, but about respect and empathy. "You don't know who's sitting in front of you," he'd say. "So treat everyone as if they matter, and because they do." Over time, his story became quietly known within the airline. Not as gossip, but as an example of humility and transformation. Many staff members who had once seen him as distant or strict began to admire him for his openness and humanity. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't want applause. All he wanted was to keep flying, with purpose, with awareness, with heart. Years later, during an industry event, he crossed paths with the woman once more. They were both invited to speak about improving passenger experience and inclusivity in aviation. When he saw her again, his face lit up with a humble smile. She smiled back. They didn't need words this time. The look of understanding between them said enough. When it was her turn to speak, she told the audience, "We can build bigger planes, faster systems, and better airports. But unless we build better hearts, none of it will matter." The room fell silent. Even those who didn't know her story could feel the truth in her voice. Later, the pilot stood on stage and said, "I once made a mistake that I thought would end my career. But it didn't end anything, it began something new. It taught me to fly not just with skill but with conscience." The audience applauded. After the event, they met again near the exit. The pilot smiled and said softly, "Thank you for believing I could change." She replied, "Everyone can change one if they truly want to." Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd like any other traveler, blending into the busy airport that had once been the scene of their hardest day. The pilot watched her go, then looked out at the sky through the tall glass windows. Planes were taking off in the distance, climbing higher and higher into the light. He stood there for a moment, breathing in deeply, grateful for second chances, and for the reminder that sometimes the best journeys don't happen in the sky, but inside the heart.